Imagine this. You're standing on a public sidewalk doing absolutely nothing wrong, minding your own business, when suddenly a police officer walks up to you, gets uncomfortably close to your face, and says, "You need to move along right now or I'm going to arrest you." And in that moment, your heart starts pounding, your hands start shaking, and every instinct in your body is telling you to just comply, just walk away. Just do what the officer says because he has a badge, he has a gun, and he has the full weight of the state behind him. But here is what that officer does not know, and what most people standing in that exact situation do not know either. And it is the single most important piece of information you will ever hear in a situation like that. That officer just broke the law. And if a lawyer is watching that interaction, whether in person, on a recording, or even through a live stream, that single moment of unlawful police conduct can unravel an entire case, cost a department hundreds of thousands of dollars in civil settlements, end a police career, and in some extraordinary cases, send a law enforcement officer to prison because the law does not stop applying the moment someone puts on a uniform. And today, we are going to go deep, slowly, clearly, and completely into what actually happens when lawyers catch cops breaking the law, why it matters more than most people realize, what the legal process looks like from beginning to end, and we are going to walk through real examples that will show you exactly how this plays out in the courtroom, in the headlines, and in real people's lives. Before we get into the specific moments when lawyers catch cops breaking the law, we need to understand one foundational principle that makes all of this possible. And it is a principle that sits at the very core of the American legal system and the legal systems of most democratic nations around the world. And that principle is this: no one is above the law. Now, I know that sounds like something you would read on a motivational poster or hear in a civics class, but it is not just a nice idea, it is a legally enforceable reality. And the mechanism through which it is enforced is called the Constitution. Specifically, in the United States context, the Fourth Amendment, which protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures, the Fifth Amendment, which protects you from self-incrimination, the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees your right to counsel, and the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the law and due process. And when a police officer violates any one of these protections, they are not just making a professional mistake, they are committing a constitutional violation, which is a category of wrongdoing that opens up an enormous number of legal consequences. And a skilled attorney can see those violations happening in real time, often before the officer even realizes what they have done, because lawyers are trained to spot the exact moment when authority crosses the line into illegality. So, let us talk about the specific situations where lawyers catch law enforcement officers breaking the law, and let us be very specific and very detailed here, because the devil, as they say, is always in the details. The first and most common situation is an unlawful stop. And here's how that looks in practice. Imagine a young man is driving home from work late at night, he's going the speed limit, his lights are on, his registration is current, and a police officer pulls him over. The officer says, "You looked suspicious," or "You were in a high crime area," and the officer searches the car and finds something, let us say a small amount of marijuana. Now, this seems like an open and shut case for the prosecution, right? Wrong. Because when that young man gets a lawyer, the very first thing that lawyer is going to do is look at the reason for the stop. And if that reason does not meet the legal standard of reasonable articulable suspicion, which means specific facts that would lead a reasonable officer to believe that a crime was being committed, then that stop was illegal from the very beginning. And under a legal doctrine called the Exclusionary rule, established by the Supreme Court in Mapp versus Ohio in 1961, any evidence found as a result of that illegal stop cannot be used in court, and it gets thrown out entirely under what lawyers call the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine, which means if the tree, the stop, was poisoned and illegal, then everything that grew from it, the search, the evidence, the arrest, is equally poisoned and equally inadmissible. And suddenly, that open and shut case is completely dismissed, not because the person was innocent of possessing the marijuana, but because the officer broke the law first. The second major area where lawyers catch cops breaking the law is excessive force. And this is perhaps the area that carries the most emotional weight because it involves physical harm to real human beings. Under the Fourth Amendment, police officers are only permitted to use force that is objectively reasonable given the circumstances. That is the standard established by the Supreme Court in Graham versus Connor in 1989. And what that means is that the force used must be proportional to the threat presented, and if it is not, the officer has committed a civil rights violation under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, which is a federal civil rights statute that allows individuals to sue government officials, including police officers, for violating their constitutional rights. Now, let's look at a real and deeply important example, the case of George Floyd in 2020, where a Minneapolis police officer knelt on Mr. Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds while he was handcuffed and on the ground, presenting no physical threat whatsoever. And multiple lawyers watching that video recognized immediately that what they were seeing was not just a policy violation, it was a crime. It was murder, and the legal pursuit that followed resulted in the conviction of former officer Derek Chauvin on charges of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. And this happened because lawyers, civil rights organizations, and prosecutors looked at that footage and applied the law exactly as it was written, holding an officer accountable in a way that was historically rare and legally significant. And it sent a message to law enforcement across the entire country that body cameras, bystander footage, and skilled legal representation have fundamentally changed the landscape of police accountability. The third major area is illegal searches, and this is where some of the most fascinating legal battles take place, because the Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches are incredibly specific, deeply technical, and often misunderstood by officers in the field. For a search to be legal, officers generally need either a warrant signed by a judge based on probable cause or one of a very specific set of exceptions: consent, plain view, search incident to lawful arrest, exigent circumstances, or the automobile exception. And when an officer searches a home, a car, or a person without meeting these requirements, a lawyer can challenge that search in what is called a suppression hearing. And if the judge agrees that the search was unconstitutional, everything found during that search is thrown out entirely. Here's a real-world example that illustrates just how powerful this is. In 2012, in the case of Florida versus Jardines, the Supreme Court ruled that when police brought a drug-sniffing dog onto a man's front porch without a warrant, that was an illegal search under the Fourth Amendment because the porch is part of the home's curtilage, the protected area immediately surrounding a home. And as a result of that ruling, any evidence discovered had to be suppressed, and the case fell apart entirely. And this happened because a defense attorney looked at the facts, understood the constitutional boundary, and caught the officers on the wrong side of it. Now we come to one of the darkest and most troubling categories, which is false arrest and fabricated evidence. Because these are situations where officers do not just make mistakes, they actively lie, plant evidence, or manufacture probable cause where none exists. And when lawyers uncover these situations, the legal consequences can be severe, including criminal charges against the officers themselves. The Central Park 5 case is one of the most haunting examples in American legal history. 5 teenagers were coerced into giving false confessions for a crime they did not commit. They spent years in prison, and it took a lawyer willing to dig into the details, combined with a DNA match to the actual perpetrator, to expose what had been done to those young men. And the city of New York ultimately settled the civil case for over $40 million because lawyers proved that the rights of those 5 individuals had been catastrophically violated. And more recently, in Baltimore, a federal investigation exposed a rogue gun trace task force unit where officers were literally planting guns on innocent people, stealing money and drugs during raids, and filing false reports. And it was federal prosecutors and defense attorneys who unraveled those cases one by one, resulting in multiple officers being convicted of racketeering, robbery, and civil rights violations, some of whom received federal prison sentences, which demonstrated that when the legal system is working correctly and attorneys are doing their jobs with courage and precision, even corrupt police units can be dismantled entirely. One of the most significant shifts in the landscape of police accountability has been the rise of body cameras, dash cam footage, and civilian smartphone recordings. And what this technology has done is give lawyers access to irrefutable visual evidence that either confirms or contradicts what an officer wrote in their police report. And you would be astonished at how often those two things do not match. When a lawyer sits down with a client and then compares the client's account to the officer's written report and then watches the body camera footage, and all three tell completely different stories, that lawyer has found not just a defense strategy, but potentially evidence of criminal falsification of official records, which is itself a felony in most jurisdictions. And this is exactly why so many police reform advocates have pushed for mandatory body cameras with strict policies against tampering. Because the camera does not have a motive, it does not have a bias, it does not benefit from lying, and it captures reality as it actually happened, giving lawyers the raw material they need to hold officers accountable in ways that were simply not possible 20 years ago. When a lawyer successfully proves that an officer broke the law, the consequences can flow through multiple systems simultaneously: the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, and the internal affairs or administrative system within the police department itself. In the criminal system, an officer can be charged and prosecuted just like any other citizen, and they can face prison time. In the civil system, under Section 1983 and related statutes, the officer and sometimes the municipality can be sued for monetary damages, which is why cities across America have paid out billions of dollars in police misconduct settlements over the past 2 decades. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Baltimore have each paid tens of millions in a single year for police misconduct claims. And that money comes from taxpayers, which creates enormous political pressure on city governments to demand better training, better oversight, and better discipline within their police departments. And internally, officers can be suspended, demoted, fired, and in some states placed on what are called Brady lists or Giglio lists, databases of officers whose credibility has been so compromised by proven dishonesty that prosecutors are legally required to disclose their history to defense attorneys in any case they are involved in, which effectively ends their ability to serve as a witness in court and renders them unable to do their job. Here is the truth that I want you to carry with you long after this video ends. The law is a system that was built to protect human beings from the unchecked abuse of power. And when that system works the way it is supposed to, when a lawyer stands up in a courtroom or in a deposition or in a suppression hearing and says, "This officer broke the law, and here's exactly how, and here's exactly what the Constitution says about it," that moment is not just a legal maneuver. It is democracy in action. It is the living proof that no badge, no authority, and no uniform places any human being beyond the reach of accountability. And the more people understand their rights, the more people document their interactions, the more communities demand transparency, and the more lawyers are willing to fight these cases with courage and precision, the closer we get to a system where the law truly means the same thing for every single person, regardless of who they are, what they look like, or what side of the badge they are standing on. Know your rights, demand accountability, and never forget that the law belongs to all of us.